the widow's lost the sun dipped low behind the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the small clearing where Mara stood clutching her youngest child to her chest. The forest around them whispered with the rustling of leaves, and, somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled. A mournful sound that echoed her own heartbreak. Only days ago, Mara's life had been whole. Her husband, Elias, a strong and steadfast man, had promised to return from the neighboring village with supplies. But fate, cruel and unforgiving, had different plans. A sudden storm had caught him on the mountain trail, and when Mara finally learned the news, the unbearable truth shattered her world. Elias was gone. Now, alone with her 3 children, Mara felt the weight of her loss as heavy as the evening sky. Her eldest, Lena, only 12, stood by quietly, her eyes filled with a blend of sorrow and determination. The middle child, Tomas, was barely 8, still too young to understand the depth of their peril but old enough to sense the change in their mother's spirit. The youngest, little Sarah, just 2 years old, clung to Mara's side, oblivious to the tragedy but unsettled by the tension in the air. Mara's small cabin, nestled at the edge of the wild woods, had been their sanctuary. It was humble rough-hewn logs, a stone hearth, and a tiny garden that Elias had tended with care. Now it felt like a fragile shell, vulnerable to the harshness outside. Winter was approaching, and the wilderness could be merciless. Mara knew the village would soon prepare for the cold months, stocking food and securing shelter, but without Elias, their meager resources would not last. She stared into the fading light, her mind racing with grim calculations. How long could they survive here? How would she protect her children from hunger, from the bitter cold, from the unseen dangers lurking beyond the trees? The days that followed blurred into a relentless struggle. Mara forced herself to push past grief, to wake before dawn and gather what little she could from the forest: wild berries, roots, and occasional small game. The children helped as best they could, but their youthful energy was no match for the deepening hardship. Nights were the hardest. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, rattling loose branches against the roof. Mara would hold Sarah close, humming soft lullabies Elias used to sing, her voice trembling with fear. She refused to show. Lena and Tomas huddled together near the fire, their faces pale in the flickering glow. One evening, as a fierce storm rolled in, Mara's heart clenched with fear. The rain pounded the roof like 1,000 tiny drums. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in brief, blinding flashes. The children cried out as thunder shook the earth. Mara wrapped her arms tighter around them, whispering promises she hoped to keep, that they would survive, that they would find safety. But the wild was indifferent. It did not care for promises or prayers. A tree struck by lightning crashed near their cabin, splintering in a shower of sparks and debris. The structure groaned and shifted under the assault, the fragile roof sagging dangerously. Mara's eyes welled with tears, but she forced herself to act. She ushered the children under the sturdier part of the hearth, shielding them as best she could. When dawn finally broke, the storm passed, leaving a quiet destruction in its wake. The forest was littered with broken branches and leaves soaked through. Their cabin had suffered damage, but it still stood barely. Mara knew then that staying in one place was no longer safe. The wild had marked them, and if they remained, it would only be a matter of time before hunger or injury claimed them. With a heavy heart, she began to pack what little they owned: a few blankets, dried food Elias had prepared, and her most precious possession, a small wooden pendant Elias had carved for her before he left on his final journey. The children watched silently as Mara prepared. Lena, with newfound resolve, helped gather the supplies. Tomas tried to carry what he could, his small hands trembling but determined. Sarah clung to Mara, sensing the urgency but trusting her mother's strength. Before setting out, Mara knelt by the fire and whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for the safety of her children. She vowed to face whatever lay ahead, no matter the cost. The wilderness was vast and unforgiving, but a mother's love, she knew, was fiercer than any storm. And so, as the sun rose high, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, Mara led her children away from the ruins of their home and into the unknown wild where their fate hung precariously in the balance. And survival was far from certain. Into the wild, the forest seemed endless, a vast sea of towering trees, tangled underbrush and whispering shadows. Mara moved steadily forward, her children following closely, their small feet crunching softly on the carpet of fallen leaves and broken twigs. The weight of the journey ahead pressed heavily on Mara's shoulders, But she refused to let despair take hold. For her children's sake, she had to be strong. The morning air was crisp and cool, the scent of pine and earth filling her lungs. But with every step deeper into the wilderness, the landscape grew wilder, less familiar. Paths they had once taken to gather food now seemed like faint memories, swallowed by time and nature's relentless reclaiming. Lena, always alert and quick, scanned the treetops for signs of danger. Tomas clutched a small wooden stick he had found near the cabin, brandishing it as if it were a sword. Little Sarah trudged on beside Mara, her tiny hands gripping her mother's skirts, her wide eyes taking in the strange new world. Mara kept a careful watch. The wild was full of unseen threats, poisonous plants, hidden ravines, and animals that hunted not just for survival but territorial dominance. The thought of wild wolves or bears prowling nearby tightened her chest, but she dared not show her fear. They had no clear destination. The village was too far, and the paths too uncertain after Ilias's death. Instead, Mara hoped to find a familiar landmark or creek they had often visited or a clearing where wild berries grew in abundance. Food was their most immediate concern. Hours passed. The children grew weary, their movements slower and their spirits dimmer. Tomas tripped over a root and scraped his knee, letting out a sharp cry. Mara quickly cleaned the wound with water from her flask. Binding it with strips torn from her shirt, she murmured soothing words, trying to mask her own growing anxiety. "Are we lost, Mama?" Lena's voice trembled as she looked up at her mother. "Will we find a way home?" Mara forced a smile. "We will," she said firmly, though inside, her heart wavered. "We just need to keep going. We can't give up." But the forest was vast, and the sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon. The shadows grew long and deep, twisting among the trees. Mara knew that nightfall would bring a whole new set of dangers. Freezing temperatures, prowling predators, and the chilling silence that pressed heavily on the soul. As they walked, Mara's mind wandered to the stories her mother had once told, her tales of spirits that roamed the woods, both benevolent and malevolent. She shook the thoughts away. Now was not the time for superstition. Still, she felt a presence, something watching from the shadows. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent her heart racing. The children noticed, too, clinging closer. When the last light faded, Mara knew they had to make camp. She found a small hollow sheltered by thick trees and quickly set to work. Using branches and leaves, she fashioned a crude shelter. She gathered dry wood and carefully built a fire, the flames licking the darkness away and offering a fragile comfort. Around the fire, the children huddled close, their faces pale and drawn. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and Mara knew their supplies were nearly gone. She handed them the last of the dried meat Elias had packed, rationing each small piece carefully. "Tomorrow," Mara promised, "we'll find food. I'll find food." But sleep was fitful and brief. Strange sounds surrounded them, hooting owls, the distant growl of animals, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Mara's dreams were haunted by Elias's face, his final smile before the storm, and a dark unknown that stretched endlessly ahead. Morning came with cold fingers, wrapping the forest in a fog that blurred vision and muffled sound. The children woke shivering, their energy sapped by the bitter night. Mara wrapped them tightly in blankets and set out to search for water and food. Near a cluster of moss-covered stones, she found a small stream trickling clear and cold. She knelt to fill her flask, the icy water a rare gift. Then she ventured further, eyes peeled for berries or edible plants. She found a patch of wild strawberries, bright red and fragrant. Carefully, she gathered what she could, mindful to avoid the thorny bushes nearby. As she returned to camp, a sudden rustle in the undergrowth froze her in place. Her breath caught. A shadow moved just beyond the tree line, a deer. Or something else. She held her breath, heart pounding. Then, just as quickly, the figure vanished into the mist. Back at camp, she shared the berries with the children, their faces lighting with gratitude. For a moment, hope returned. But Mara knew this was only the beginning. The wilderness was vast, unpredictable, and full of peril. They had stepped beyond the safety of their old life and into a world where survival demanded strength, cunning, and courage beyond measure. And Mara was determined to find that strength for her children, for herself, for the promise of a new tomorrow. Signs of despair. Days turned into weeks, and the wilderness showed no mercy. Mara's hope, once a fierce flame, began flickering under the relentless weight of hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The forest no longer felt like a place of possibility. It had become a silent adversary, testing every ounce of her strength. The children grew weaker. Lena's bright eyes dulled, and her small hands trembled when she reached for food. Tomas's usual boundless energy waned, his laughter replaced by quiet sighs. Even little Sierra's cheeks, once rosy and full of life, became pale and sunken. Mara's heart ached each time she looked at them, the pain sharper than any wound. Mara herself felt the creeping numbness of despair but refused to surrender. Every morning she forced herself out of the fragile shelter they had built, searching for food and clean water. The forest that had once seemed generous now seemed barren, its resources scarce or hidden. The cold nights gnawed at their bones, and the dangers lurking beyond their small fire grew bolder. One afternoon, Mara spotted wild mushrooms growing near a fallen log. She knew some were poisonous, but desperation clouded caution. She gathered a handful and brought them back, hoping they were safe. After a small meal, Tomas began to cry out in pain, clutching his stomach. Mara's blood ran cold. She tended to him through a long, agonizing night. Fever took hold, burning him with cruel intensity. Mara's hands trembled as she wiped his brow and whispered prayers for relief. Lena stayed awake, holding Tomas's hand, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. In the dim light of dawn, Tomas finally fell into a restless sleep, his breathing steady but weak. Mara's relief was tempered by fear. If the forest could poison her child, what other dangers lurked unseen? Desperation pushed Mara to venture farther than before, deeper into unknown parts of the forest. Her legs ached and her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she moved with purpose. She knew the children depended on her survival. She discovered a small creek, its waters fresh and clear. Kneeling, she drank gratefully and filled her flask. Nearby, she found a patch of wild carrots. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. On the way back, the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees thicker, the shadows darker. A sudden snap of a branch made her freeze. She turned slowly, scanning the underbrush. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched persisted, prickling at her skin. Back at camp, Mara shared the carrots and creek water with her children. Their weak smiles warmed her heart, reminding her why she could not give up. But that night, as she sat by the fire, Mara's thoughts drifted to Elias. She wondered if he had faced this same wilderness alone. If he too had felt swallowed by the silence and the cold. She clutched the wooden pendant he had carved for her, tracing its smooth edges with shaking fingers. Suddenly, a low growl shattered the fragile quiet. Mara sprang to her feet, eyes searching the darkness. Her heart pounded as glowing eyes appeared beyond the firelight. A large wolf stepped forward, its sleek fur blending with the shadows. It growled again, a warning and a challenge. Mara, breath caught, she grabbed a sturdy branch, ready to defend her family. The children huddled behind her, trembling. But then, something unexpected happened. The wolf paused, its eyes fixed on Mara, not with hostility, but with an almost curious calm. Slowly, it backed away, disappearing into the night without another sound. The encounter left Mara shaken but oddly hopeful. The wild was dangerous, yes, but not all its creatures were enemies. Perhaps, she thought, there was a balance, one she had yet to understand. The days that followed tested them further. A sudden storm flooded their camp, forcing them to seek higher ground. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and Mara's hands trembled as she prepared what little food remained. Yet, through it all, she held on to a fragile thread of hope, a belief that, somehow, some way, they would survive. For if she lost hope, she feared they truly would be lost to the wild forever. The silent warrior appears. The forest had grown colder, darker, and more relentless. Mara's strength was stretched to its limits, and the children's frailty haunted her every step. Yet she pushed onward, driven by a fierce mother's love, and the desperate hope for salvation. One gray afternoon, as a heavy mist curled between the trees, Mara led her children along a narrow, winding path that seemed barely touched by time. The damp earth muffled their footsteps, and the thick canopy filtered the light into an eerie twilight. Suddenly, a sound reached Mara's ears, a faint rustling, too deliberate to be a simple breeze. Her heart quickened. She stopped, signaling the children to do the same. They crouched low, eyes wide, breath held tight. From behind a cluster of moss-covered rocks emerged a lean, and cloaked in worn leather and furs. His face was shadowed beneath a hood, and he moved with a quiet grace that made him almost part of the forest itself. The children gasped softly, clutching Mara's skirts. She took a careful step forward, unsure whether this stranger was friend or foe. The man said nothing. His gaze met Mara's, calm and steady, as if he had been watching them for days. Slowly, he lowered a hand and revealed a bundle wrapped carefully in leaves and cloth. It was food: wild roots, dried meat, and fresh water. Mara's eyes widened with gratitude, but her voice caught in her throat. The man said nothing, merely gestured for them to eat, then turned and disappeared silently into the mist. For a moment, the family sat in stunned silence. Then Lena whispered, "Who was that?" Mara shook her head, still overwhelmed. "I don't know, but he helped us." That night, as the children ate and rested, Mara's mind raced. Who was this silent stranger? How had he survived so long in these woods? And why had he chosen to help them? Days passed, and the mysterious man appeared again, always without a word, always bringing food or clearing dangerous paths. Mara noticed how the children grew stronger with each visit. Tomas's cough eased, Lena's eyes brightened, and little Sarah smiled more often. Despite his silence, the stranger's presence became a quiet comfort. Mara began to follow him from a distance, learning how he moved through the forest, how he read the tracks of animals, found fresh water, and sensed changes in the weather. She watched as he built traps, set snares, and gathered medicinal herbs. His skills were extraordinary, honed by years of solitude and survival. Yet, he never spoke of himself or asked for anything in return. One evening, Mara found him resting by a fire, carefully tending a small wound on his hand. She approached cautiously, holding out a bundle of herbs she had gathered. He looked up, eyes meeting hers for a long moment. Then, slowly, he accepted the gift and nodded a silent thank you. Mara realized then that he was no ordinary man. He was a guardian of the wild, a silent warrior who lived between the shadows and light of the forest. His silence was not emptiness, but a language all its own. With his help, Mara's family began to regain their strength. Together, they repaired the damaged shelter, collected fresh water, and hunted game. The silent warrior taught Mara to listen to the wind, the birds, the subtle signs of nature's secrets, but beneath the growing trust, Mara sensed a deep loneliness in the stranger. His eyes carried a sorrow she could not name, as if he had been carrying a burden for longer than she could imagine. One night, as the fire crackled and the stars glittered above, Mara sat beside him. She broke the silence for the first time. "Why, do you stay hidden?" she asked softly. He looked at her, then nodded toward the woods, his gaze distant. Mara understood. The wild had claimed him long ago, shaping him into its quiet protector. And now, by helping her family, he was giving them a chance to survive when all hope had faded. For the first time since Ilias's death, Mara felt a flicker of peace. They were no longer alone with the silent warrior by their side. Perhaps they could face whatever dangers the forest still held on. Maybe, just maybe, find a way back to life. The battle against the wild, the days that followed, marked a turning point. With the silent warrior guiding them, Mara and her children began to face the wilderness not as helpless wanderers, but as survivors fighting back against the wild. Their small camp became a place of hope and renewed strength. The warrior taught Mara how to read the signs of the forests, the subtle tracks animals left in the mud, the patterns of birdsong that warned of approaching storms, the way the wind shifted among the trees. Each lesson was a step toward reclaiming control over their fate. One morning, Mara woke to find the warrior preparing snares near the edge of the clearing. His movements were swift and sure, a practiced dance honed by years of solitude. He showed Mara how to set a trap with careful patience, how to bait it so the game would come unsuspecting. Lena watched intently, her curiosity rekindled. "It's not just waiting." The warrior finally broke his silence, voice low but steady. "It's understanding." With renewed determination, Mara worked alongside him, setting traps and gathering wild plants. Tomas, now stronger, helped to carry the catch, while little Sarah watched with wide eyes, clutching her mother's hand. But the wild was not easily tamed. One afternoon, while tracking a deer, Mara and the warrior came face to face with danger. A large bear, disturbed by their presence, lumbered from the shadows. It growled, deep and menacing, its eyes locking onto Mara with a predator's intent. Mara's heart hammered. She froze, but the warrior stepped forward without hesitation. Without a word, he grabbed a sturdy branch and waved it firmly. His calm confidence seemed to ripple through the air. The bear hesitated, growled again, then, after a tense moment, retreated back into the forest. Mara exhaled deeply, her pulse racing. "Thank you," she whispered. The warrior nodded but said nothing. As the days passed, the challenges continued. Heavy rains flooded their camp, forcing them to seek higher ground. A sudden cold snap threatened to freeze the small stream they depended on. Mara's hands blistered from gathering firewood, and Tomas's cough lingered despite the fresh air. Yet with each obstacle, the family grew stronger. The warrior taught Mara how to build shelters that could withstand storms, how to find clean water sources, and how to identify plants that could heal wounds or soothe fevers. The children learned to gather berries without harming the bushes, and Lena began to understand the delicate balance of the forest. Together, they worked as a small tribe united by struggle and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Mara sat by the fire, the children asleep nearby. The warrior sat beside her, the first time he had willingly shared the quiet space. She looked at him, her eyes searching. "Why do you help us?" she asked softly. He met her gaze, then pointed toward the forest. The meaning was clear. This was his home, and protecting those who respected it was his mission. In that silent exchange, Mara found not just an ally but a protector, a bridge between the wild and her family's fragile humanity. The battle against the wilderness was far from over. But with the silent warrior's guidance, they had reclaimed a measure of control. They had become fighters, survivors, not victims. And as the firelight flickered across their faces, Mara dared to dream of a future where they would not just survive, but live. A new hope with each passing day. The forest no longer felt like a prison but a place of renewal. Mara and her children, strengthened by the silent warrior's guidance, began to see beyond mere survival. They began to dream again. The air was sharper now, crisp with the approaching change of seasons. Yet inside the shelter they had fortified together, there was a warmth that no storm could extinguish. The children's laughter, once scarce and faint, returned in soft bursts as they learned the rhythms of the wild. Lena, inspired by the warrior's quiet strength, took on new responsibilities. She became Mara's right hand, helping gather firewood, tending the small garden patches of wild herbs, and teaching Tomas how to track animals through the underbrush. Mara watched her eldest daughter with pride. The resilience in Lena's eyes reminded her of Elias, strong, brave, and unyielding. The silent warrior, though still reserved, shared more of his knowledge. He taught them how to preserve food for the long winter ahead, smoking meat over low fires and drying herbs to stave off illness. He showed Mara how to weave baskets from the supple branches of young trees and where to find shelter in rocky caves if the weather turned fierce. One day, Mara found herself standing on a ridge overlooking the forest valley below. The sun cast golden light across the treetops, and in the distance, she spotted thin columns of smoke, rising signs of human life. Her heart leaped. Could it be the village? A chance to reconnect, to rebuild what had been lost. She shared the sight with the warrior, whose gaze followed the smoke thoughtfully. Though he remained silent, Mara sensed a shift in unspoken understanding that their journey was nearing a new chapter. The family began preparing for the trek back. They packed carefully, gathering the last of their provisions and reinforcing their shelter to weather the cold months if needed. That night, as they sat by the fire, Mara held Sarah close. The little girl's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she smiled a peaceful smile that filled Mara with hope. Lena and Tomas leaned against the warrior, their faces glowing with newfound confidence. Mara looked at the silent warrior, and for the first time, she felt like they were truly a family bound, not by blood alone, but by shared hardship and trust. Before dawn, Mara knelt beside the fire and whispered a prayer of thanks for Elias, for the warrior, for the strength that had carried them through the darkest days. As the first light painted the sky, the family set out together, moving cautiously, but with purpose, toward the smoke on the horizon. The wild was still behind them, its trials etched deep into their hearts, but ahead lay a new hope, a chance to reclaim their lives, to find community and safety. With the silent warrior beside them, Mara knew they were ready. No longer doomed by the wild, they were survivors, stronger, wiser, and forever changed. Fate's new dawn. The morning air was crisp and clear, as Mara and her children, guided by the silent warrior, began their journey toward the distant smoke rising from the valley. Every step was heavy with hope and uncertainty. The forest behind them had tested their limits, but ahead lay the promise of something new. Safety, community, and perhaps even healing. Tomas walked steadily now, his cough nearly gone, his cheeks regaining color. Lena carried Sarah with gentle care, and Mara felt a deep gratitude for the silent warrior whose watchful presence gave them courage and strength. The path was rough and tangled, but the warrior moved with uncanny ease, leading them through hidden trails and past dangers Mara never would have dared face alone. His eyes caught details others missed: the faintest footprints, the quietest streams, the signs of animals, both friend and foe. As they drew closer to the village, Mara's heart beat faster. The familiar shapes of cabins emerged through the trees, smoke curling from chimneys, and voices distant, but unmistakable, reaching her ears. When they finally stepped into the clearing, villagers paused, startled by the sudden arrival of the family and their silent protector. Mara's children clung to her, wary but hopeful. The village elder, a kindly woman with weathered hands and a warm smile, approached slowly. "You're safe now," she said gently, her eyes resting on the silent warrior. "Thanks to him, I see." Mara nodded, tears streaming freely. "He saved us from the wild, from despair. Without him, we wouldn't have made it." The warrior gave a rare, faint nod but remained quiet, his gaze calm and steady. In the days that followed, the village welcomed them with open arms. Mara's children found friends among the other children, laughter filling the air where silence had reigned. The village healer tended to Moss's wounds and taught Mara new remedies drawn from both forest and field. Mara herself began to rebuild, helping with the harvest, mending homes, and sharing the wisdom the warrior had imparted about living with the land instead of against it. Yet, the silent warrior remained apart, watching over the village from its edge, a guardian between worlds. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Mara approached him at the forest's border. "Will you stay?" she asked softly. He looked at her, then slowly shook his head. "My place is here in the wild," he said quietly, his voice barely above the wind. Mara nodded, understanding the weight of his choice. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He turned then, melting into the shadows of the trees, becoming once again the forest's silent protector. Mara watched him go, her heart full not just with gratitude but with the fierce hope that he would always be near, watching over them from the wild. She looked back at her children playing with new friends, laughter ringing like music on the breeze. Their fate had changed, no longer doomed by the wild, but forever shaped by its trials and its guardians. And as night fell, Mara whispered a prayer to the stars above, knowing that in the dance between wilderness and home, a new dawn had truly come.